I really appreciate Megan saying that I show up as helpful, because one of the things I like to do, and even as I was getting my mind in gear for our time together this morning, I thought, who do I want to be at the Wellness Conference today? And I do this a lot, whether it's with a one-on-one meeting or an event I'm going to, and I said the first thing on my list was, today I want to be helpful. And I also want to be curious to learn from the other speakers and their own perspective and their own flavor, and I'm already learning so much from that. And I just want to be present. And so I'm glad I get to be present with you here now for this third talk. And way to go, way to be for prioritizing that mental health and being, I think there's an element of courage that it takes to say, yeah, this is something that's like not perfect for me, and I want to grow here. You'll see in the perspective that I bring that I really believe in the idea of like marginal gains. So I'm not going to stand up here and the stuff we talk about with anxiety today and say, oh, comprehensive change will happen. I mean, and Megan's addressed that, Andrew addressed that. It's not like, oh, we're going to wipe the slate clean. But some change is possible. And I know that for two reasons, both of which are part of my background. I do have some pastorness in my background, just made that word up. Some kind of I've done some seminary and a DMin, and so I've got kind of this theology flavor in my background. And so I know from that, and I believe that through Jesus, restoration and growth are possible. He's created us as dynamic beings. But I also have come to know and appreciate that through being, I guess, an amateur neuroscience geek. Like, I don't have any degrees for it, but it's just something I'm really interested in and passionate about. And you may know this word in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, which is the idea that our brains are plastic, like not plastic like a toy, but plastic in that they're dynamic. They're always rewiring ourselves. And your brain and my brain wire themselves according to two things: our experiences and what we pay attention to, and our relationships. And so we see both through the teaching and the life of Jesus and through the lens of neuroscience that, hey, some change is possible. We are dynamic beings. As Andrew said, we're in constant transformation. And so we can take hope in that. So we're going to talk about what anxiety eats for breakfast. Let's anthropomorphize it a little bit. Why not? We could also call this, though, the physiological dynamics of stress and anxiety. What's going on inside the body when that takes place. And we'll do a whirlwind tour of what that looks like. I can think back to being a newlywed at 22 years old and standing in the kitchen with my wife and just casual conversation saying, I'm just not a very stressed out person. In fact, I don't get stressed. And it has become like this eternal inside joke in our family now. Like, we are always making fun of me for that. And I don't want to belittle my younger self, right? But if I could go back, I would just put my arm around my younger self and say, well, for one thing, you are emotionally out of touch with yourself. and in a serious sense, like the pain you've experienced in your life, the reason you don't feel anxious or stressed or anything, is just because you numb yourself out to your triggers. So that was problem A, but problem B is, to a degree, we don't get to choose, these triggers as they come into our life. Like, I had no idea that 3 years after I told my wife, I don't get stressed, I would have a complete nervous breakdown, which was characterized by major social phobia, major social anxiety, and would take me years to work through an understanding of myself and kind of replacing that with a healthy narrative. And so it's like, none of us can say, well, I'm just not like a stressed out person, because triggers come into our life whether we like it or not, right? As I was trying to wrap my mind around, like, well, what's the problem? Like, why are we even having this conference today? What's the problem that tends to permeate and kind of nag us when it comes to anxiety. And I decided I gotta be really careful how I say this. I decided to label this our big ask problem. This is our big ask problem. And let's see if this resonates with you, because this is coming straight out of my heart. I feel like the world never stops asking me for something. There's never a sphere of my existence that isn't signaling me, telling me to do more. And even when I can quiet those demands, I'm left with a nagging sense of mercilessly high expectations for myself. That's what stress feels like for me. It's 800 things at the same time. And really, so many of us are triggered when we feel that we don't have the inner resources to manage the situations that are in front of us, right? Like, I don't have what it takes to complete this project and give my 4 kids all of their different breakfasts that they're yelling at me for, and this and that. And it's like, a million things all at once. And even if I can shut down all those signals, I'm still in my own head. And I'm still yelling at myself. That's our big ask problem. That's what we're facing. Talking about zooming out here, adding a little bit of nuance to this idea of anxiety and a little kind of bit of texture to it here. I would suggest that anxiety really exists on a spectrum of disintegrated presence. Anxiety is a spectrum of disintegrated presence. And in neurological terms, the idea of integration is the degree to which parts of our brain are communicating with each other. So when parts of our brain are working together and in harmony, and they're linked up, and the signals are firing all across the brain, that is integration. So your brain has many, many different parts and regions, and it would seem to be a good thing if our whole brain was involved in our life, right? That's good. But when anxiety happens, that's not what's happening. Anxiety creates this spectrum of disintegrated presence, and so let's talk about that a little bit here. So way down here on the spectrum, just like very minimal anxiety would be maybe what you felt when you walked in the door today. Your alarm went off and you realized, I'm going to the anxiety conference. I feel a little anxious. Which is, for some of us who maybe are struggling, when we're in theory with mild anxiety, like you wake up and you're like, well, I'm excited for this, but there's some butterflies in my stomach about that. So way down here on this very tame side of the spectrum, there's nerves, there's shyness may fit in that category. But then here I would say maybe what I experienced was probably in my mid-20s with the social phobia, social anxiety and stuff like that. I'd put that here in the middle of the spectrum. It was very difficult for me to go about my day to day. I actually had that nervous breakdown right before I had to go speak in front of a group, and really didn't want to do that. It's interesting and maybe encouraging or helpful for you to know if social anxiety is kind of something you struggle with in your life. 60% of the American public. So it's the majority. 60% of people are dealing with some form of social anxiety or feel that little bit of angst there. So it's not a small number. And then here, as we move towards this side of the spectrum, these are what we could call clinical anxiety disorders. And Andrew gave his disclaimer. I'll give mine. I'm not a mental health professional, right? There are 4 or 5 clinical anxiety disorders that would fall in this mix here, and maybe that's something that you are working with a professional on, and you're on this side. And so as we move further and further down, what anxiety does is it dislocates us from our presence. It kind of dislocates our mind from our body in a sense. Harvard Business Review found that 46.9% of the time, that's very precise, So 47% of the time, people are thinking about something other than what they're doing right now, which is a big part of what's going on with anxiety, right? We are making fearful judgments about the future, or about ourselves, or about other people, or about what they might think. And what that does is it robs our ability to be here, now. That is thievery. It's thievery if half of the time my body is in a place, but my mind isn't there. And so it's a real challenge. It's real pressure to deal with here. Let's talk about what's going on in the body when we're actually triggered. What's taking place here? You can build a model of your own brain with your hand very cheaply. So if you take your thumb, stick it here in the middle of your palm and wrap your 4 fingers around it here, you just built a model of your brain. Go you. So you can see our brain exists in 3 parts. It's kind of a tripartite piece. Down here by your wrist would be your brainstem, which is responsible for the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, it helps to think about it in terms of like a seesaw. There are 2 modes, parasympathetic and sympathetic. So parasympathetic means it's like a restful state. It's a calm state. It doesn't necessarily mean you're sleeping, but you're calm. You're resting, digesting, all that. Sympathetic is the state that your autonomic nervous system is in when you are activated. So if you just did an intense workout, or if you just got a scary email, or if the project that you're working on at work just took a huge sideways turn, or yesterday, if you're sitting in a coffee shop and you're working and you copy and paste an hour's worth of work, and except it didn't copy when you copied it, and you lost the work. And then it's okay. So, but I'm losing myself here, losing my presence. So we've all been there. So imagine that parasympathetic and sympathetic as like a seesaw, or maybe like a soundboard with levels constantly being adjusted based off of what we experience in our circumstances. The middle part of this brain model, where your thumb is, would be what people call the emotional brain, or the limbic system. And that's composed of a few different regions in there that we'll talk about with the loop of anxiety in just a second, but that's the emotional brain. It's important to note that language doesn't live in the emotional brain, right? It's interesting, like there's a part of my brain that doesn't use words or language. Yeah, that's the limbic system. And then the top 4 fingers here on your brain would be the neocortex, or the cerebral cortex. It's responsible for a lot of the stuff that makes us uniquely human. So decision-making processes, executive functioning, deciding what to do in response to our emotions. It's also responsible for language as well. So that's a 90-second tour of our brain. How does all of that fit into what happens when we're triggered? When we, and this is in your notes, when we sense or perceive a threat, the amygdala is the alarm system for our brain. And it's here in the thumb, not literally, but in the model, right? The amygdala is the part of our limbic system that sounds the alarm. Whoa, hello, this is a threat. What are we going to do in response to this? And it's really important to realize as we deal with wherever we are on the spectrum of anxiety, sometimes our amygdala raises the alarm about things that are imaginary. Sometimes our amygdala raises the alarm and we don't need the alarm to be going off, which is when anxiety can really start to disrupt our day-to-day and our relationships and our responsibilities, right? And so we'll talk about how to manage that and how to navigate that. But here in this moment, amygdala senses a threat and then signals the hypothalamus, which is also in the limbic system. It's a next-door neighbor to the amygdala. The hypothalamus is a part of our neuroendocrine system. So endocrine is like hormones. And so when if you step out into the road and a car is running a red light and boom, you jump out of the way even before you have time to think about that, right? Say thank you to your hypothalamus. Give it a sticker or a high five or something. Your hypothalamus, what it did is phase 1 of this stress response gave you a shot of adrenaline or epinephrine without you even having to think, oh, I should move out of the way of this car, right? Your body just acted as a result of that hormonal boost from the stress response there. Now, wherever we are, if we're resting and digesting, if we're in maybe a calmer parasympathetic state, when that amygdala alarm goes off and our body senses a threat, we immediately shift to sympathetic state, a state of activation. So what's going on there? Well, and this is what's very helpful for us. You can learn to feel this in your body if you haven't already, right? I certainly have learned to feel this in my body with my 4 young kids. I can feel this in my body when I get an email from that doesn't sit with me in the right way from a coworker or whatever the case might be, right? And so what's happening when we shift into that sympathetic state is respiration goes, our body's getting ready to act, so respiration goes up, heart rate increases, digestion is slowed or stopped, or your body hits eject, which is what happens if you get really nervous, right? And interestingly, in our sympathetic state, our immune system is downregulated. So when we stay in a constant go, go, go sympathetic state, our immune system is actually compromised. And that's just phase 1 right there. What can take place next is if we keep that foot on the gas pedal and we tell our brain this threat is still a threat, then our body will continue to flush our system with a hormone that you may have heard of called cortisol. Now, cortisol is a naturally occurring hormone in our body. It peaks in the morning when you wake up. It's like your body's own wake-up juice, right? It's the go, it's an on switch for your system. And that peaks in the morning and naturally would down-regulate through the day. But what can happen sometimes with insomnia or anxiety or perpetual low-grade chronic stress is that these cortisol levels get all out of whack. And by when we're supposed to go to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock, our cortisol levels are still through the roof and we can't go to sleep. So then we're watching TV and taking in blue light, which reduces melatonin input and makes it more difficult for us to sleep, unless you're wearing blue light blocking glasses, which is a great idea. So all of these things can, we get in this loop. And what's really challenging is I was actually going to bring like a piece of chain to symbolize this, and my wife was like, "That's a really cheesy analogy. Don't do that." So there you go. Thank my wife that I don't actually have a dumb analogy up here. But you can imagine it. You can imagine this as like a little piece of chain. And what happens if we have one anxious moment is this body that's in motion tends to stay in motion. We tend to move, continuing on in the spectrum. And so, well, why are you anxious right now? Well, because I was anxious 5 minutes ago. Well, why were you anxious 5 minutes ago? Because of this other thing that happened. And so we get in these states of anxiety, these states that connect to each other 1 minute to the next, linking up with each other. And before you know it, like that's just the norm. That's what we're in all the time. And our presence is disintegrated. What I mean by that on an existential level is we're not able to bring our true self into the room. When you and I are anxious, to whatever degree, we miss out on the gift of bringing our true self, our non-anxious self to others. And we miss out on the gift of experiencing ourselves in that way. On a leadership level, my favorite definition of leadership, I read it from a guy named Peter Steinke. And he said, leadership is this. Leadership is a self-defined person with a non-anxious presence. So someone who has such deep self-definition, if you're a follower of Jesus, that definition being your union with Christ, the fact that he accepts you irregardless of failures or perceived inadequacies or shortcomings, any of that. So rooted in this deep self-definition allows me to be present with you in a way that if you're yelling at me, I don't have to yell back at you. I'm not going to amplify that anxiety. If you're bringing a crisis to me at work, I don't have to go into crisis mode. I don't have to amplify that anxiety. I have such deep self-definition in any scenario, at family, with a work project, whatever it might be, that I can operate out of self-definition and respond rather than react and letting the amygdala run the show. Does that make sense? Cool. By the way, I'll say I had to cut this talk in half. I had just way more material than we would ever have time to go through today, but part of the beauty of the size of this event and everything is that if there's something I say that piques your interest, or you just want to talk more about how a principle might be individualized to you, I would love to meet you. And so pop over to my table over here at any time today, and we can talk more about that. So that's our physiological loop of stress and anxiety. That's what's going on in the body. Kind of zooming out and just thinking about how anxiety affects our personhood, and if you battle anxiety at any level today, what is a good goal for you? I'm popping up a different translation of what Megan shared earlier from Philippians 4. I like some of the nuance and the wordings here. So the Message translation says, "Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers. Let God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life." And then this, you might not be able to see, but it's bolded here on the screen. "Summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse." So Paul's providing some direction for what we should pay attention to. Why? Well, Paul didn't know all the neuroscience that we know these days, but again, what we pay attention to forms the architecture of our brain. What we pay attention to literally rewires and reshapes our brains, and this is what Paul is saying ought to be a part of our life. I read, wasn't planning to share this, but I recently read a book from Russell Wilson's mental conditioning coach, Trevor Moawad. And it was really interesting. In the book, he describes a 30-day experiment that he went through. So he thinks a lot about the mind, right? Moawad does. And he said, I want to do a 30-day experiment where I fill my brain with negative stimuli and see if I can sort of overcome that and make it through. And so for 1 month, every day, he was planning to listen to 1 hour of news, do an hour and a half of hard rock music, and then an hour and a half of country music. And by day 26, this mental conditioning coach had a nervous breakdown. And he could not complete the assignment. He had to text some of his friends and his business partners, and he texted Russell and some of the other guys he was coaching and said, I know I haven't been myself this month. My presence was disintegrated. You know, why? Because of stimuli. Stimuli is part of what feeds our states. And again, not to say at all, we can totally eliminate the anxiety in our life. No, but we can steer it one direction or another, right? We know that. What we feed grows and what we starve diminishes. That's just reality. We can tip the scales based off of, to use a different word than what Paul's talking about here, through our stimuli. And looking at this too, it's almost as if, at least in this translation, or rendering of the passage, a sense of God's wholeness is sort of posed as the antithesis of anxiety. And that's exactly what I would suggest here, moving forward as we kind of step into action. Wherever you are on the spectrum of anxiety, I think a good goal for you, for me, is not to say, man, my highest goal for my mental health is I just don't want to feel bad. Like, we can do better than that. Like, if life gets better than the side of the spectrum where we just have a little anxiety. Like, as I was preparing for this and thinking about it, I realized, like, man, there's a whole other spectrum that God wants to bring us onto, that we can jump onto. And that's what I wanted to share with you in this next piece here. Thinking about wholeness. Wholeness, I would define as neurological and existential integration. It's the opposite of what we said anxiety was, right? Wholeness is neurological and existential integration. So everything linking up and getting connected. Starting here on the baby side of the spectrum of wholeness would be whole brain integration. What we said, so our whole brain is talking to each other. Going back to some of the brain science of this, that's really cool. I'm applying some of this in my home. So my oldest is 9 years old, but he is a scientist. Like, legit. I don't know what he'll do. His future job probably hasn't been invented yet, but he is super smart. And so he's also super 9 years old. And so the other day he had a large blow up about something that probably his amygdala was on red alert, nuclear war level, very upset. He went to his room and cried for probably 40 minutes. And he came back out, and when he was calmed down, we use terminology in our home that probably would be helpful in workplace or your family too. We call it green zone, is where we're calm, where we're healthy. If you're freaking out, you're in the red zone, and you need to go sit in that special chair that we have where you can calm down. And so he comes back out, he's back in the green zone, and I say to him, hey buddy, did you know that there's a part of your brain in the limbic system called the insula? And what your insula does is it helps you notice what's happening in your body. It's what we mentioned earlier, when we sense we've been triggered. So James, when you feel you go into panic breathing, when you feel your heart rate go up, when you feel your body start to shake, you can notice that that's happening. That is like the penultimate first skill for any of us here who are looking to address the real presence of anxiety in our life, is to note the sensation in our body and to just be aware of it. And you have an entire part of your brain for that. It's pretty cool, the insula. And you can train that part of your brain. And so what I said, James, maybe next time, instead of 40 minutes to get back into the green zone, maybe next time it would be 20 minutes. And maybe after that it would only be 5 minutes. And he was like, yeah, and then maybe after that it would only be 2. Yeah, you're getting the picture. Right? So train your insula. I would put that as the first step of this piece of whole body integration. To feel symptoms of that anxiety that plagues you coming on. Step 1, train your insula. Just note it in your body. Note it in your body and say, it's here. My breathing has just increased. On that note, sometimes we talk about, this is just kind of a freebie, not in my notes or anything, but sometimes we talk about deep breathing, aiding that parasympathetic state, and that's not quite accurate. What we need to do to activate the parasympathetic state is lengthening our exhaling. It's interesting. And so sometimes I'll practice something called 2x breathing, where you say breathe in for 3 seconds and then breathe out for 6 seconds. So if you're really, and this is something that I'll do, like if I start to freak out, right? Do that 2x breathing. Just a really simple mindfulness trick that you can do there is doubling the length of your exhale versus your inhale. So thinking about whole brain integration, that would be a first piece, train your insula. Here's a second piece as well. is that your amygdala can become friends with your prefrontal cortex. In our brain hand model here, the pinky would be like the prefrontal cortex. It's a part of your neocortex right behind your forehead. And what your prefrontal cortex can do, if your amygdala invites it to the party, is they can form a connection where the PFC begins to down-regulate the alarm system for the amygdala. And here's just a super practical way that you can do this, right? So in the emotional brain, where the amygdala is firing the alarm, and the hypothalamus is pumping your body full of cortisol, that stress hormone, right? And you're freaking out about, you fill in the blank, right? Remember that in that limbic system, in the emotional brain, there's no words or language there. So here's what you can do with that specific worry, that specific threat, is the simple act of writing that down on paper will involve your neocortex. But because as you put words to that problem, out of necessity, you're linking up the part of your brain that is responsible for language with the emotional brain. And so, over time, your prefrontal cortex can literally develop a neural pathway with that amygdala, and they can be integrated. It can come to work together in a way that serves you, in a way that's helpful. Whole brain integration is kind of that first piece towards wholeness. And all of that, I would say, really the journey of, isn't the journey of life just to become more of who we really are? Right? To bring more of our true self into the world as we discover who we are in Christ, who God has made each one of us uniquely to be, understanding who you and I are relationally, as we each function uniquely relationally, and they each have unique social flow. And so that integration, that linkage allows us to begin to bring integrated presence into every single moment, because I can be here with you right now. And I'm not worrying about 10 minutes from now. I'm not worrying about what happened 10 minutes ago. I'm just here with you right now. And so it's this beauty of integrated presence, and which leads us towards the goal of, at least it's my goal in life, I think probably for all of us here, is a whole life integration. Where I like to imagine life as an ecosystem where some of us have very unexplored and underdeveloped parts of it. But what I'm interested in is exploring the whole thing, mapping the entire thing, and having every part of my life link up with every other part of my life, so that there's no segmentation or fracturing or anything like that. And it all starts with our mind being integrated. So wholeness is neurological and existential integration. With the few minutes that we have left here, I will probably just do kind of a fire hose of actions. And my disclaimer for this would be, these are going to be highly individualized and contextualized to you based off of where you kind of fall on the spectrum of anxiety, based off of medical professionals that you're working with, based off of your goals, and all of that. Highly contextualized to you. But a few pieces here. What renewal pathways can guide us towards that wholeness? I like that question a lot more than just, how can I not be anxious? That's not the goal. We want to move towards wholeness. So number one, I'd say observe individualized biological rhythms and markers. Structure your day, week, month, and year according to those rhythms. And I would say that in our go, go, go culture, that many of us, almost out of a sense of necessity, have become so good at ignoring what your body is trying to tell you. Like, it's easy to fall into that, isn't it? And so you hit that 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock afternoon lull, and you've got whatever your fix is for that. You know, a cup of coffee or a candy bar or whatever that might be. That used to happen to me all the time. And then I started tracking my macronutrient intake and realized that I was every single day eating about 1,000 calories under what I should be eating. for my fitness goals and for my body type. And it's like, oh, that's why I'm tired all the time. And I continue to do that if I don't track my nutrition. So guess what? I track my nutrition every day because it matters to me, and I want to listen to the signals that my body are telling me, and I want to give my body enough nutrition to do what it said. I also track my sleep using a sleep tracker because, hey, that's important to me. I'm not going to say, go perform, body. Go be creative. Go perform at a high level, but do it on 6 hours of sleep. That's not good enough for me. Thinking about the way, and this is where some real creativity and individualization could come into play too for you. If you have the freedom to design your work week or your work day, why not do that in a way that matches with the ebbs and flows and sort of the hormonal tide within your body? So for me, and again, I'm using myself as an example because I don't know everyone here, but hopefully this is helpful. So I know I do my best creative work when it comes to thinking and creating content. I do my best deep work in the morning. So that's what I'm going to block out in my schedule. That's what I'm going to do. I know that if I have a day full of meetings, I need at least 5 or 10 minutes of margin in between those meetings so that I don't carry my state from one meeting into another meeting. Because the conversations are different, and I want to live one conversation at a time. So for you, maybe just a really simple idea for something like this with your meetings would be, before I go into a meeting, I spend 5 minutes remembering that I'm here now and thinking about the sort of social presence that I want to bring into this meeting. And you could do, what I like to come up with 3 adjectives that describe, like, this is who I want to show up as in this meeting. Just creating buffer, creating margin in those biorhythms. Gosh, there's more that we could say there, but there's another one, so we got to keep going. Developing a process for renewing and rewiring your mind. Only in the last year have I begun to do, and Megan kind of joked and made fun of me for it, I don't just sort of casually learn about things. I read like 50 books on things and do that. And so that's what I've done with meditation. And I would say, at least for me personally, after trying many different kinds of meditation and everything, I guess I did what I do, and I've developed sort of and designed my own personal framework for meditation, which is adapted from cutting-edge neurology that trains 3 different parts of the brain, and there's 3 different segments of this meditation practice that I now do daily, as well as what I would like to think is a pretty theologically robust component to it too. I'm not personally interested in like a nebulous spirituality. For me, when I meditate, I'd like to meditate with Jesus. I think he's a pretty marvelous guy, and when I take that time, I want to make sure that I'm enjoying my union with him. And so this is something that has been so helpful to me personally. It's replaced what has kind of been a relatively lifeless prayer life for me, because I'm such an achiever and always feeling like, I've got to pray all the right prayers and journal the right thing. And this has just been such a peaceful thing for me. I want to share this for free with people, and I'm kind of working on a white paper for that right now. So I have a website that I use for coaching, but what you could do is go to ecosystemmentality.com, and at the bottom of the homepage there's just a free thing. I'll be done with this in probably early April. ecosystemmentality.com, and if you just fill in your email there, I'll send it to you when I'm ready to unveil it to the world. I love to, on this note of renewing, rewiring your mind, do you remember Romans 12? Romans 12, where Paul says, don't be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it's really interesting to think about, this is crazy, but Have you ever stopped to realize that Western civilization has created a certain type of brain? Ian McGilchrist talks about this in his book, The Master and the Emissary, where we have created a brain that is almost entirely left dominant, so future-minded, action-oriented. The right brain is essentially this little black sheep that we hide in the corner, and it's atrophied and ignored. And so our culture has created a certain type of brain. I want to encourage you with this today. By saying anxiety is a problem in my life, something that shows up, you're not being a whiny Westerner, okay? We're not just manufacturing stuff to complain about out of thin air, because there is a very real sense, and we could do a whole different talk on this, there is a real sense in which aspects of our global culture that are present today, and were not present 30, 40, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, unique dynamics of our culture have formed our brain in unique ways and have created what is an epidemic environment for anxiety. Doctors right now, guys, are calling anxiety the black plague of this generation. Over 90% of doctor visits are said to be related to stress incidents. Crazy. But what Paul says, don't be conformed to that pattern. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's possible through Jesus, and Jesus created us with brains that can rewire themselves based off of what we pay attention to, our relationships and our experiences. Amazing. So that daily practice, whatever that should look like for you. And then this last piece here, as we start to land the plane, I would say schedule regular white space. It's valuable margin for creativity, movement, and rejuvenation. And this is very open-ended. It can look different for each of us. But have you ever, I'll put it this way, have you ever been working on a problem or kind of ruminating on something, and you're sitting, you're working it, you're trying to write the proposal, or you're trying to solve it with your analytical mind, and then you go take a shower, or you take a walk around the block, and in that moment you have an epiphany, right? It's as you stop thinking about it. Guess what happens is sometimes your brain needs a stinking break, so that this is a real thing, so that subconscious parts of your brain can actually contribute to the conversation and help solve problems. And that can only ever happen if you create some white space. And so this could be so many different types of things, and whether that's creating something for the sheer joy of it, like not for work, but creating by working on your garden, or creating the art that you like to create, or creating, right now, I have to create a life-size BB-8 robot for my son's science fair next week, and somehow he tricked me into it. And I'm horrible at building things, guys. It's probably the most stressful thing in my life right now, ironically. But I think it's fun for my son, hopefully. So creativity, movement. You know, I used to own a gym, and so I'm way into fitness and nutrition. And you know what I figured out the best workout routine is the one that you want to do. Because if people aren't having fun with something, they don't stick with it. So for you, break a sweat every day doing something that you love. Something that's enjoyable for you. Creativity, movement, rejuvenation, that little white space is so valuable, and we need that in our world today in order to be whole people, to bring our true selves into the world. So with that, I'm at my time. I'm gonna wish you guys if I had wishes to give out or blessings to give out, I'm gonna wish for us presence. I'm gonna pray for us wholeness. I'm gonna pray that we would be able to notice anxiety and what our body's saying to us in those moments, and that we'd then be able to have enough wisdom to guide what happens next. We don't control when we're triggered, but we do control the response, right? And we can feed that or starve that anxiety. So thanks for the time, guys, and I look forward to connecting with you one-on-one later today as we talk. So thanks.